everybody, and welcome back to Coffee with the Consultants. I'm Michelle Duss, and I'm a social emotional consultant with the Florida Center for Early Childhood down in Northport.
And I'm Stephanie Essex, and I'm social emotional consultant at the Florida Center for Early Childhood here in Sarasota. And today we're bringing you parenting tips and tricks and the time it takes to have a cup of coffee.
And today we wanted to talk about grief and loss. We wanted to give you some tips and tricks and some information to help us navigate our children through grief and loss. Usually when we think about grief and loss, we typically go straight to the loss of a loved one, the death of a family member or a close friend.
Mhm.
And we wanted to talk a little bit about how loss and grieving a loss can encompass so much more than just somebody passing away. It can encompass loss due to moving, loss and grief that we experience when we change schools or have major life changes, friends moving away, the loss of a pet, separation from family members, whether that's through divorce or through court involvement and foster care. And the biggest thing that we're all going through is this pandemic that we're in as well. And these can all bring up experiences of grief and loss for our children, and they may be things that we're not thinking about.
Definitely.
Yeah, and experiencing that. So when we talk about grief and loss, the other thing that we tend to do is we tend to think about it within the framework of grief and loss in adults. And we don't always think about how it looks different with children. So the response to grief and loss in children looks a lot different than what it does in adults, and how we can help our kids is going to be different than how we help our adult friends and our adult family members. And children, a lot of times you're going to see behaviors and you're going to see changes in behavior. So you may see regression where somebody, maybe your child was potty trained and now all of a sudden they're starting to have accidents at night. Or, you know, they're very outgoing and they're starting to be more withdrawn from their social groups, or seeing decline in grades with school-age children, or maybe acting out. So you're going to see their response to whatever their grief and losses that they're experiencing in behaviors. And so if you're starting to see these behaviors and they seem to be out of the blue, maybe take a moment to assess what's gone on in your world, because it may not be obvious, as obvious as the death of a loved one. And so you think back and say, oh gosh, well, you know, we did just change schools, or we just, in our case, we just switched from being homeschool to going to brick and mortar school and then going back to homeschool. So in that sense, our children are experiencing a sense of loss and grief for the friends that they're not seeing on a day-to-day basis in that structure. And so we at times see some of these behaviors, and we need to take a step back and analyze why might these be suddenly popping up.
Absolutely.
To grief and loss.
I wanted to back up just for a second, or maybe on to what you were saying. You know, I think a few things, because you did mention that children and adults, that they grieve differently. Some of it looks similar, but a lot of them look different. And so I wanted to kind of identify that, you know, kids, when they grieve, it's in these little tiny chunks.
Yes.
See them, you know, being playful one minute, and then the next minute they might be crying or acting withdrawn or having somatic, you know, symptoms such as aches or stomach aches, you know. And you mentioned regression, and I think that's a good point. You know, when kids experience grief and loss, you know, we'll see maybe thumb sucking returning, or, you know, bedwetting, or even some kids regress on their speech, you know. So there's some things to look out for, you know. And a lot of times, you know, children, and this could be, you know, younger children or older children, they actually will postpone their grief to allow the adults to grieve first. So they wait for their parents to get through their stages of grief. And that could be anywhere from 2 to 5 years. They'll wait and grieve later in life. So it could come unexpected.
That's such a great point.
Yeah. And I think about that as more like if you do lose grandma or a family member, a lot of times in those instances, they do postpone their grief. So, and kids also, which I think adults do too, they express a lot of grief in their actions. So they act out their feelings. And we know through play, kids express a lot of themselves. And so a lot of their play might, really represent like what they're going through. And that could be those changes like you talked about, Michelle, or even a loss of a pet or a loss of a loved one. So there are definitely some differences, when it comes to kids and grief. And, you talked about physical and behavioral responses, you mentioned, regression and withdrawn, those somatic symptoms are definitely come out, in headaches and stomach aches.
Sure do.
And other things, I think cleanliness is one that I've seen a lot.
Yes.
With big changes, especially like if parents are separated, or if they're separated from, I should say, caregivers or their adults or even siblings, they will cling a lot to their caregivers or their attachment figures, I should say.
Right.
Also, we see a lot of like crying, might be restless or hyperactive too. And some kids just, they don't eat well, they don't sleep well. I mean, there's a lot of these things. So like Michelle had said, if you're noticing any of these things and it seems really out of the ordinary, it's a good idea to, talk with your child, do the detective work to figure out what things might be happening for the child that are causing these behavioral and physical responses. And then I think the next step is just to reach out for support.
Sure.
We do a lot of those supports, but there's therapists in the communities that can offer support. We have some resources here. I don't know if you want to share. You had a resource that you wanted to share, right, Michelle?
I do. I have one that I have planned and one that I just kind of thought about based on an interaction that I had earlier this week. One is particularly when kids are separated from their families, if there's a family photo sheet or something that's quick for them to grab, that's a great way for them to be able to look at that and just kind of feel connected to those family members that may now live out of state, or now you live out of a separate state. And that was something that was utilized actually in the classroom earlier this week with a child that was having a hard time with a family member that doesn't live in the state anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I really like that. The other thing that I have is a book that we used, and forgive me, I don't have the jacket for the book, but I have the side here. It's called Dog Heaven, and it's a book that we used with our girls a few years ago when we lost our dog. It was something that we were able to read to them and just help them navigate and just feel a little bit more comfort. And it also opened a little bit of a conversation for us with any of the questions or concerns that the girls might have had regarding the loss of our dog.
I actually have one of those too. Mine's a little bit different, but I have Invisible Leash, Patrice Karst, which is a really cool book about losing a pet. And then of course my favorite, which I talk about a lot in Coffee with the Consultants, is The Invisible String by the same author. And it's just a really good way to talk about how we're all still connected, even if we're from each other or we miss each other. It's kind of a cool way to talk about that with your kids. I know that also, I just want to throw this out there, but Tidewell here in Sarasota also has Blue Butterflies, which is like a grief group, which is really a cool opportunity for kids and families. So if you're experiencing a more of a grief loss over like the loss of it could be a pet or a caregiver or attachment figure, is also a good resource. So
that is a really good one. And they have locations in the North County area and South County as well. And it is free to the community. So
That's
to
great.
reach out to them. Mhm.
Well, we love being able to provide you with information and of course, lots of resources. We're here if you have any questions. If you do have questions or you need information, just email us at info@thefloridacenter.org and we'll be happy to get back to you. For the Florida Center schools, we're going to be doing a grief and loss Starfish Cafe, which is an extended version of Coffee with the Consultants, pretty much. But we're going to be talking even more about how to help your child navigate grief and loss. We look forward to sharing that with you coming in October.
Fantastic.
I know we really love helping it out and just being a support for you. So if you need anything from us, we're always here and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.